Having explored Hayek's political philosophy, particularly his warnings about the road to serfdom and the virtues of an open society, we now delve deeper into a less frequently discussed but equally vital aspect of his intellectual legacy, his work as a philosopher of law. While Hayek is often celebrated for his economic theories, his writings on law and jurisprudence represent a significant, if sometimes overlooked, contribution. He wasn't just an economist dipping his toes into legal waters. He was engaging with fundamental philosophical questions about the nature, justification, and proper functioning of law. Central to this exploration is his powerful distinction between two kinds of law: the law made by governments, which he calls thesis, and the law that evolves spontaneously within society, which he terms nomos. So, what exactly is this core distinction Hayek makes? On one side, you have thesis. This is your classic top-down law. Think of it as the sovereign, the king, the parliament, the elected assembly imposing rules through coercion. It's the law of legislation, designed and enacted by some authority. Hayek argues this type of law tends to reflect the interests of whoever holds power, the ruling class or the state itself. Then there's nomos. This is the law of liberty. It's not handed down from above. It emerges from the ground up, spontaneously, through the countless interactions of free individuals trying to coordinate their lives, resolve disputes peacefully, and build a functioning society. It's the law that arises organically from human action, not from deliberate design. For Hayek, understanding this difference is absolutely key to grasping what liberalism truly requires in terms of law. To fully appreciate Hayek's take on law, we need to understand his broader framework for thinking about order itself. He distinguishes between two fundamental types of order. First, planned order or taxis. This is order that comes from deliberate design, like a military general planning a battle strategy. You see it in any organization created intentionally. It's constructed, artificial, exogenous. But then there's spontaneous order or cosmos. This is where things get really interesting. Cosmos is order that emerges from the actions of many individuals without anyone consciously designing it. Think about language. No single person invented English grammar, yet it works remarkably well. Or consider markets, though Hayek notes with some dismay that many people still struggle to grasp this idea, often dismissing Adam Smith's invisible hand as mere nonsense. The point Hayek emphasizes is that these spontaneous orders are real, they exist, and they are incredibly important. Assuming everything needs a designer invites authoritarianism. Now, let's bring this back to law. Why does this cosmos versus taxis distinction matter for law? Well, law is fundamentally about enabling cooperation and social life. We need stable expectations about how others will behave so we can plan our own actions. Some laws, of course, are deliberately made. That's legislation, the taxis of law. But Hayek argues there's another kind of law, what he calls grown law. This is law as a spontaneous order nomos. It arises naturally from the evolved mechanisms societies develop to resolve disputes peacefully and allow people to coexist. Think about customs, precedents, common understandings of fairness that emerge over time. Hayek insists that assuming all law must be deliberately planned is not only factually wrong, many parts of our legal system are indeed grown, but also dangerous for liberty. Hayek points to the English common law as the prime example of this grown law, this cosmos. It's not some grand design cooked up by a committee. It emerges from the repeated ways people interact, settle disputes, and figure out what's fair. Juries try to apply commonly accepted rules, reflecting a general consensus on justice. Judges follow precedents, building on past decisions. And crucially, while the police enforce rulings, the very tradition of respecting judicial decisions stare decisis gives the common law its force. It's a system that's both stable enough to provide predictability and vital enough to adapt over time, all without being centrally planned. It's law discovered, not invented. Now, there's a scholarly debate here worth mentioning. John Hasnas has pointed out that Hayek might be conflating two related but distinct concepts: common law and customary law. Common law, as Hayek uses it, involves the role of judges and the doctrine of stare decisis, the idea that courts should respect past decisions. Customary law, however, refers more directly to the bottom-up evolution of norms and practices within communities. Hasnas argues that if judges can inject their biases into the common law process, then Hayek's claim that neutral objective rules will spontaneously evolve might be shaky. He suggests that stare decisis itself is relatively recent historically. However, even if Hayek's terminology isn't perfect, the underlying insight remains valuable. The common law, despite its complexities, does exhibit patterns and stability that emerge from collective practice, much like the spontaneous orders Hayek champions. So this law that grows spontaneously, this nomos, is precisely what Hayek identifies as the law of liberty. Why? Because it possesses qualities essential for a free society. It provides the stability of expectations needed for cooperation. It's fluid and adaptable, able to respond to changing circumstances. And crucially, because it emerges from the interactions and shared practices of society members, it tends to be acceptable to them. It's not imposed from above. It reflects the lived experience of the community. This makes it inherently more conducive to the values of liberty than laws that are deliberately crafted by a central authority. Why is the top-down law, the thesis, problematic, even when enacted by a democratic majority? Hayek argues it's not just about tyranny. Even well-meaning legislation faces fundamental challenges. The biggest issue is the knowledge problem. Legislators, however smart, simply cannot possess all the information needed to create perfect laws for every conceivable situation. They lack the detailed local knowledge embedded in existing practices and spontaneous solutions. Hayek calls this naive constructivism, the dangerous belief that we can consciously design a perfect social order. Because of this inherent limitation, thesis laws are inevitably incomplete, rigid, and likely to interfere with the very spontaneous processes that generate prosperity and peace. Nomos, on the other hand, is more like discovery, finding rules that already work or figuring out necessary complements to existing ones. It's part of the natural world, not just an invention of the legislator's mind. Hayek has a very specific definition of coercion. It happens when one person's actions are forced to serve another's will, not their own. It involves the threat of harm and the intention to control behavior. Why is this bad? It's not just morally questionable. Practically, it prevents the coerced person from using their own knowledge and abilities to pursue their own goals. Most complex human endeavors require chains of connected actions decided upon as a coherent whole. If the facts determining your plans are controlled solely by someone else, your actions fit into their design, not yours. Thesis law, being imposed from above, inherently fits this definition of coercion. Nomos, however, doesn't involve a single coercer imposing a will. It's an emergent system of rules, not a command structure. Does this mean Hayek wants to abolish all legislation? Not entirely. He acknowledges that grown law isn't infallible. Sometimes it might need correction. Why? Two main reasons. First, the slow pace of judicial development might lag behind rapidly changing circumstances. Think about technological revolutions or unforeseen crises. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it's difficult and undesirable for judges to simply reverse a long-established trend, even if it turns out to be undesirable later. That goes against the very function of the common law system. Hayek might point to cases like Kellofi, New London, where judicial decisions led to a perceived erosion of property rights, as situations where corrective legislation could be appropriate. Of course, this relies on the assumption that the legislative body would actually act in the interest of liberty, and not just expand its own power. Okay, so we have this tension. Hayek champions spontaneous law nomos but also allows for corrective legislation thesis. How do we prevent the latter from becoming a tool for oppression? How do we distinguish good thesis from bad thesis? Hayek's answer lies heavily in constitutionalism. He looks at the U.S. Constitution as a model. Its purpose, he argues, was to protect the people against arbitrary action by all branches of government, including the legislature. It restricts not just how the legislature operates, but also what it can aim to achieve. On this view, any corrective legislation should be strictly limited to promoting individual liberty, acting as a safeguard against the potential overreach of the grown law system itself. Hayek also draws a distinction between private law and public law, though he immediately clarifies that the labels aren't about whose welfare they serve. Instead, private law concerns rules of just conduct, the kind of rules that facilitate peaceful cooperation and are best served by nomos, the spontaneous order. Think of it like Adam Smith's invisible hand. By confining individuals to non-coercive activities, mutual respect and cooperation flourish, even without anyone intentionally directing it. Public law, on the other hand, deals with the rules of organization, particularly concerning the government. This is where thesis, legislation, seems more appropriate. The danger, Hayek warns, is confusing the two, letting the state impose public law rules onto private conduct, substituting thesis for nomos and inevitably leading to coercion. What are the consequences of this confusion between thesis and nomos? Hayek sees two major ones. First, it paves the way for legal positivism, the idea that any law properly enacted by the state is legitimate, regardless of whether it respects individual liberty. Second, it strengthens the implicit socialist and totalitarian tendencies within positivism, because such laws inevitably reflect the interests of the ruling class or the state. To counter this, Hayek advocates for a constitutional regime that strictly limits what he calls social legislation. He's not against all social goals like providing police services, but he's deeply suspicious of legislation aimed at directing private activity towards particular ends or benefiting particular groups. This, he argues, is substituting thesis for nomos and making the state treat citizens and their property as mere objects of administration, eroding both liberty and the understanding of it. Now, let's shift gears slightly and look at Hayek's place within the broader landscape of 20th century liberalism. His influence, especially through works like The Road to Serfdom, has been immense. His critique of central planning proved prescient, and his ideas spread widely, even reaching intellectuals behind the Iron Curtain. He helped establish influential think tanks dedicated to spreading liberal principles. Yet paradoxically, he remains a marginal figure in contemporary political theory. You won't typically find university courses solely focused on Hayek's political thought, nor will you see him prominently featured in major discussions of liberal theory, unlike thinkers like John Rawls. This raises fascinating questions. Why hasn't Hayek been more central to modern liberal thought? What exactly is his contribution, and what is his lasting legacy? At its heart, Hayek's liberalism is a response to socialism. He finds the socialist aspiration to organize society according to a grand collective purpose deeply implausible and fundamentally incompatible with individual freedom. This stance rests on two crucial assumptions. First, and this is Hayek's great contribution alongside Mises, is the feasibility of spontaneous order. He argued forcefully that complex social orders can and do arise without central command, and that attempts to consciously control or direct social processes are doomed to fail and destructive of liberty. Institutions and rules, for Hayek, are repositories of dispersed knowledge. Second, his definition of freedom is specific. It's not about controlling your environment or achieving collective self-government. Freedom means having a protected sphere where others don't interfere, allowing you to pursue your own purposes. This contrasts sharply with Marx, who envisioned true freedom emerging only when humans consciously controlled the social forces they had created. Hayek dismisses this as a delusion born from underestimating the limits of human reason and knowledge. Regarding equality, Hayek acknowledges its importance, specifically noting equality before the law as a key goal of the struggle for liberty. People should be treated alike regardless of their differences. However, he argues forcefully that this leads inevitably to material inequality. What he rejects is any attempt by the state to impose a chosen pattern of distribution, whether based on meritocracy or equal shares derived from national wealth. Such interventions, he believes, would necessitate further controls and ultimately lead to a society where authority dictates individual actions, the opposite of a free society. Hayek's liberalism, which he associates with the English tradition, stands firmly against centralization, nationalism, and socialism. Nationalism in particular is rejected. Why? Because, in Hayek's view, simply belonging to a nation doesn't grant you a right to a share of the national wealth. Recognizing such claims would create a form of collective property right, which cannot be justified on the same grounds as individual property rights. Furthermore, it would incentivize nations to keep outsiders out rather than admit them to the benefits of living within the country. The liberal ideal, therefore, must actively resist nationalist sentiments, which Hayek sees as inherently corrosive to liberty and prone to totalitarianism. So, where did this fierce commitment to liberalism come from? While rooted in his Austrian school economics training, Hayek's focus shifted dramatically in the 1930s and 40s. It wasn't primarily theoretical curiosity. It was driven by profound practical concerns. Witnessing the rise of Nazism and totalitarianism, he saw civilization itself under threat. The danger wasn't just a particular political party winning, but the victory of ideas capable of undermining European civilization. His task became twofold. First, to subject these totalitarian ideas to sustained criticism, and second, to actively develop and promote the liberal alternative. He believed this required contributions, not just from philosophers but from historians, economists, and social scientists. And crucially, this battle of ideas had to happen not just in academia but in the public square. This urgency is evident in his early correspondence after the outbreak of war in 1939. He immediately offered his expertise to the BBC, suggesting help with propaganda broadcasts into Germany. His memorandum laid out a clear strategy: defend liberal democracy by showing its connections to cherished German traditions, and crucially, emphasize accuracy and truthfulness. He stressed that the German people were largely unaware of Nazi atrocities and needed factual information presented soberly and matter-of-factly, unlike the hyperbole of Nazi propaganda. What stands out is his persistent advocacy and unwavering belief that effective propaganda must be truthful. He wasn't just trying to win a war, he was trying to awaken a nation and strengthen its internal resistance to totalitarianism. Hayek's concern went far beyond Germany's borders. He saw the fate of Germany intrinsically linked to the future of all of Europe. In a 1944 Cambridge lecture, he expressed deep fear that Germany's collapse could plunge Central Europe into barbarism, with devastating consequences for the entire continent, including Britain. The post-war task, he argued, had to be regaining Germany for the values of European civilization. But the challenge was immense. Post-war Germany faced a moral and intellectual desert, with isolated pockets of goodwill, unable to make progress without the unifying element of shared traditions. Simply defeating Nazism wouldn't be enough. Germany needed to be reintegrated into the wider European cultural fold. Recognizing the need for action, Hayek sought practical means to foster this reintegration. He proposed an international society bringing together liberal-minded intellectuals. This wasn't easy. Suspicion towards Germans ran high, as Hayek himself acknowledged. Despite these obstacles, he persevered. His efforts culminated in the founding of the Montpellieran Society in April 1947. This wasn't just an academic exercise. It was born from a deep sense of urgency to preserve the liberal tradition against the rising tide of totalitarianism and to build bridges for intellectual and cultural renewal across Europe. Hayek's writings from this period, like his memoranda proposing an international academy, are imbued with this anxious urgency. He wrote of the imminent danger to European civilization, the threat posed by totalitarian ideas, and the widespread fatalism that made resistance seem futile. He argued desperately for a common effort to reconsider values, to identify what must be preserved, and to make people aware of the liberties they took for granted. In another memorandum, he quoted Keynes on the power of ideas, agreeing wholeheartedly that the world is ruled by little else. This reinforced Hayek's conviction that developing robust alternatives to totalitarian thought was not just desirable, but urgently necessary. This background helps explain some persistent features of Hayek's thought. First, his focus on restating rather than redefining liberalism. He wasn't trying to invent a brand new theory from scratch. As he wrote, old truths must be restated in the language of each generation. Works like Law, Legislation, and Liberty are explicitly titled A New Statement of Liberal Principles. His goal was to reinforce a tradition he saw as vital bulwark against totalitarianism, drawing together as wide a coalition as possible anyone opposed to totalitarianism, regardless of their specific shade of opinion, from liberal socialists to liberal Catholics. Second, his interpretation of liberalism emphasizes a refusal to control or shape human development. He saw collectivist doctrines like fascism and communism as united in their attempt to consciously direct society, refusing to recognize autonomous spheres for individual ends. Liberalism, therefore, is about acknowledging human ignorance and appreciating that civilization emerges spontaneously, not through deliberate design. Indeed, Hayek argued that civilization's creative powers depend on keeping social processes outside the control of human reason. Third, his persistent internationalism and anti-nationalism. He believed the threat of totalitarianism could only be met by an international movement, and that retreating into national isolationism would be fatal. This led him to call early on for a rebirth of real liberalism, true to its ideal of freedom and internationalism. Now let's contrast Hayek's concerns with the dominant currents in contemporary liberal theory, particularly those shaped by John Rawls. For decades, political philosophy has grappled with questions Rawls raised in A Theory of Justice. What constitutes a just regime? What's the proper role of government? How should benefits and burdens be distributed? A huge focus, especially initially, was on neutrality, the idea that the state shouldn't favor any particular conception of the good life, and that principles should be chosen under neutral conditions. Debates arose about whether this neutrality was desirable or even possible, leading Rawls later to emphasize securing an overlapping consensus in political liberalism. Much of this discussion focused on moral foundations within existing closed societies. Where does Hayek fit in or diverge from this? First, contemporary theory often focuses on pluralism and diversity as the main challenge, while Hayek saw the primary threat as totalitarianism. For him, diversity wasn't the problem. It was potentially a solution, provided the institutions existed. Second, Hayek refused to treat society as a closed system. His liberalism was explicitly universalist and internationalist, viewing national boundaries not as given but as problems to be addressed. Third, he paid significant attention to institutional design, federalism, separation of powers, the structure of authority, which was often sidelined in the more abstract debates of Rawlsian liberalism. Hayek's motivation stemmed from a desire to combat forces like nationalism and separatism that he feared could destroy modern civilization. His solution lay in the ideas of liberalism, which he framed as the doctrine of an abstract order. An abstract order is governed by rules of just conduct that are abstract, meaning disputes are resolved by appealing to other abstract rules, not by arguing about the specific goals of the parties involved. This allows for peaceful pursuit of diverse ends. Crucially, Hayek stressed that this abstract order, this open society, is not a community in the traditional sense. Trying to turn it into a community with common purposes, he warned, inevitably leads to totalitarianism. Why was keeping the open society open so critical for Hayek? Two main reasons. First, it's essential for the growth of knowledge. Knowledge expands most effectively through spontaneous interaction and problem solving, not through centralized control. The state, in particular, poses the greatest threat to this process. Hayek feared that advances in technology might tip the balance, allowing organized state power to crush spontaneous innovation. This resonated with Lord Acton's view that diversity within a state acts as a barrier against governmental overreach into social affairs, unlike Mill's more accommodating stance towards nationalism. Second, Hayek saw federalism as the logical extension of liberal principles. An interstate federation, he argued, could provide the necessary framework for peace and liberty on a larger scale. Hayek applied these federalist ideas practically, particularly regarding post-war Germany. Faced with the dilemma of preventing a future centralized German Reich without resorting to permanent partition, he proposed a phased approach. Initial Allied control of the central government, gradually transitioning to a federal or confederal structure as German states developed democratic institutions. Crucially, he advocated for free trade between these states, not just for economic reasons, but to prevent the kind of economic solidarity that breeds conflict between states. More broadly, in his essay on the economic conditions of interstate federalism, Hayek argued that federation's main purpose is peace, requiring both political and economic union. Economic seclusion fosters conflict between states, while political union limits the scope for extensive economic planning, thus safeguarding liberty. So, why should we pay close attention to Hayek's contributions, especially in light of his relative marginalization in contemporary theory? Firstly, his work offers a remarkably comprehensive attempt to tackle a vast array of interconnected problems in moral, social, and political theory, always keeping an eye on the realities of economic and political life. Secondly, unlike much of the recent focus on abstract moral foundations, Hayek tackled crucial institutional questions, and importantly, he didn't confine them within national borders. His vision extended to the international order, seeing federalism and an open society as integral to liberalism's mission. These aspects make his work not just historically interesting, but potentially highly relevant for understanding the challenges of our time.